Good morning, friends. One of the things we covered in this past Sunday's sermon was the reasons why Jesus was willing to speak in such a stern way to the Pharisees, even though he knew what he was saying was going to cause offense. And that's because Jesus was more concerned about protecting the flock than he was sparing the feelings of the wolves. Now, that's a simple and obvious line of logic, but we oftentimes lose sight of it, especially when we consider how a wolf with injured pride might respond next. So often, in order to avoid that fallout, we don't say what ought to be said concerning those who do attack the church. But as we consider the example of Jesus here in Matthew 12 and the testimony of the scriptures throughout, we realize that we really ought to be willing to say and do what it takes to protect God's people from harm. And that's not so much about protecting them from physical harm, though there are obviously considerations for that as well, but more importantly in this context, protecting them from spiritual harm, protecting God's people from those who would deceive them and steer them away from God's truth. Because truth is everything. Jesus said, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Friends, without the truth, we aren't free. Without the truth, we're in bondage. And as we see here, that truth comes from the word of Christ, from abiding in and immersing ourselves in his word. This is one of the greatest things that brings us assurance that we are indeed his disciples. But there are those who would lead us away from that truth, away from his word. Whether they try to do this through explicit false teaching, teaching against that truth, which would make them the classic false teacher that we, of course, have to be on the lookout for, be aware of, and to reject. Or there are those who perhaps don't have any specific desires to lead people astray, but they are simply in unrepentant and sin, and therefore they are an ungodly influence in the lives of God's people. And again, they may not teach a class or lead a discipleship group, but they nevertheless encourage and even lead people by their example to reject the truth of Christ and to go their own way instead. And this is a situation, too, that must be addressed for the sake of the purity of the church. Again, as I alluded to this past Sunday, we don't talk much about purity today. Certainly in our wider culture, the concept of purity is passé at best. But really, more often than not, the idea of being pure is regarded as stifling and oppressive, something that should be rejected outright rather than sought and treasured. But for God's people, we must be concerned with purity, both for our purity as individual believers, as well as the purity of the church. And we saw that when the Apostle Paul was teaching about the relationship between husband and wife, that the husband's desire should be the same for the wife as Christ is for the church, and Christ's desire for the church is that it be pure. We also see that working out in Paul's instructions to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, if you're not familiar with the Corinthian church, or if you are familiar with the Corinthian church, you'll know that they lived in a culture that in some ways wasn't too different from the culture in which we live today. And that is in the case of the desire for basic self-fulfillment at all costs and a careless disregard for morals. And some of that impurity was springing up within that Corinthian church. And so Paul says this to them, he writes this to them at the beginning of chapter 5. He writes, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife. And you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you." Now let's stop right there for a moment, just because I can't not address this. Because there's a man in the Corinthian congregation who's sleeping with his stepmother. And here's the thing that just stuns the Apostle Paul, which is that the general church population there in Corinth apparently knows that this is happening, and Paul says that in some way they are arrogant about it. Now, it's not possible to know with absolute certainty what their precise motivation was for their arrogance, but based on a lot of other contextual evidence and cultural things we know about the Corinthian church, it's likely that they were beginning to accept or being taught a false teaching that said that because God is gracious, then you can indulge in whatever sin you want to, especially if it's just, quote unquote, a physical sin, just something that you're doing with your body, well, then it's really no big deal. And it may have been then that the general church population was actually self-congratulatory about how gracious they were being, how loving they were being in accepting a man, even though his sins were worse than even the heathens around them. The idea could be, look at how loving and gracious and tolerant we are. And really, that's the thought that led me to say I can't let this go by, because is that not the arrogance we see in the world around us today, and most alarmingly in many of our churches today? Because, again, setting the world aside here, because the world's just the world, but those who claim to be churches, and yet they are so eager to affirm people in their sins, and then they say, look how loving we are, look how compassionate we are, look how inclusive we are. I really think that what we're seeing today is the exact same kind of arrogance that Paul was addressing here in Corinth. And Paul recoils away from that. He says, and you're arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. Rather than being proud of their affirmation of this sin, the church should have been ashamed of themselves. They ought to have been sorrowful that they had any inclination to accept this sin in the first place. And so Paul is saying, do the right thing now. Repent of your own sin of arrogance on this matter, and then remove this man from their church, from their midst. Now, we'll get into that specific command to remove him in a minute. But first, Paul continues in verse 6, writing, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now here Paul uses the ancient festival of Passover to demonstrate his point, because during that time of Passover, all the bread had to be unleavened. It wasn't to have any yeast in it. And yeast, or leaven, is used throughout the scriptures as an example of how a small little bit of something can permeate through and affect the whole thing. It drives the same point as what we might today say as one bad apple ruins the whole bushel, or perhaps more powerful yet, the idea that left unchecked, a small bit of cancer will slowly spread throughout the body and kill it. And that's the whole point in the church here. If you've got this man in the church who is engaging in sexual immorality, you can't be proud of that. You can't be proud of allowing that to remain in your church. You've got to realize the danger of that, which means, like cancer, you've got to cut it out of the church body lest the cancer spread. To that end, Paul writes in verse 11, but now I'm writing to you to not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. The steps Paul gives for maintaining the purity and health and safety of the church are drastic, but so often are the steps in combating cancer, right? And we're dealing with a similar idea. So Paul instructs the church to not even associate with those who are living in sin, whether sexual immorality or greed or any of the other things he lists. And I really don't think his intention is to give an exhaustive list at that. But if someone is inside the church and they claim to be a Christian, because as he says, people in the world are going to do what they're doing. Your responsibility isn't to judge them. But those who are claiming to be Christian, well, if they are living in unrepentant sin, and yes, we remember we all do have sin. The point here isn't to motivate to a witch hunt and pointing fingers at every little infraction or sin, but rather to identify where sin is unrepentant, where someone is holding on to their sin. Well, that person must be lovingly confronted, but confronted nonetheless. And if they remain stubborn in their sin, yes, they must be removed from the body of Christ. Why? Because a little leaven leavens the whole bunch. A small cluster of cancer cells left untreated can and will kill the whole body. And the Lord wants his body, because he's the head and we're the body, he wants his body to be healthy and strong, pure, free from any disease, any contagion, any cancer that would break it down or cause it weakness. And this is why we have things like church discipline and even church membership. Church discipline is obviously alluded to here in 1 Corinthians 5, though Jesus himself lays out the entire process in greater detail in Matthew 18, because the whole point of discipline in this manner is to maintain the purity of the church, either by the person who's in sin repenting and being restored within the church such that they are a healthy member of the church again, or by that person remaining in their sin, unrepentant, and so being cut out of the body. Now, of course, we always hope for restoration rather than expulsion, but in either case, the goal is the same, the purity and health of the body. As it is with church membership. We talk about membership in a church, in a specific church, having your name on the roll, as it were, not because there's any particular scriptural mandate that this must happen, or this must be a thing, but because we live in a very different world than they did back then. In Corinth, there was one church. Okay, if you didn't go there, that was it. But we live in a world where there's a church on every street corner, practically speaking. And so church membership is a way for us to assure each other that I'm committed to you as a brother or sister in the Lord. I'm not going to just cut and run and go to some other church at the first sign of trouble, perceived or otherwise. We have membership classes, as I'm excited to start this coming Monday, in part to make sure that we're all on the same page concerning what we believe, particularly concerning the primary doctrines of the faith, of course, because there is room for disagreement on certain secondary doctrines, but we need to be united in the first things, the gospel, who man is, who God is, and so on. But it's also for the purpose of community, again, of commitment, of saying we're more than an organization. We're more than a loose-knit confederation of individual people. No, we're a tight-knit family rooted in God and His truth, that cares about each other, and we will lovingly hold each other accountable. We're going to cry together and laugh together when it's appropriate. We're going to sacrifice for each other. We're going to love each other. And above all, we're going to point each other to Christ. That, I believe, is the significance of church membership today. In a world where it's oh so easy to just bop down the road to a place where no one knows you, in a world where it's oh so easy to keep people from knowing you, church membership is all about submitting to the fact that God doesn't want us going alone, even though we're surrounded by people. He wants us to be part of a body, His body, and He wants that body to be healthy and pure, and for us to do what it takes to keep that body healthy and pure. I love you guys. I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.